Hello there. This month I read Dracula, and there's another video about that. You can click the link to see. In any case, I wanted to talk about vampire stories as my October genre spotlight video. Now, I thought about doing Gothic literature, which is a genre that vampire stories kind of emerged out of and overlapped with quite a bit, but that was just too broad, and to be honest, I don't have enough background in it at this point to talk about it really well. So as I get more into 19th century literature, I'd like to read more Gothic stuff, and I'd like to at some point make a genre spotlight video on it, but this is not that month. This month we're just going to focus on vampire stories very specifically. As you may or may not know, vampires not only predate Twilight by several centuries, they also predate Dracula. In fact, vampires exist in the folklore of many cultures around the world, but particularly Eastern Europe. Now, as I was doing my research for this video, sources linked in the description below, by the way, I found that some people think vampires may have a connection to disease. Specifically, diseases that existed in medieval Europe that people didn't really understand. They didn't know how they were spread, they didn't know how to treat them, and so ideas about vampires may have, at least in part, originated from that. Which is why you sometimes see the idea that those who the vampire has been close to in life would be its first victims, or that being close to a vampire can transform you into one. Like, for instance, in Dracula, Dr. Van Helsing tells one of Lucy's suitors that if he had kissed her before she died and became a vampire, that when he died, he also would have become one. It makes sense to me that that would connect it to ideas about disease, because we do know that disease is spread through methods like that. But of course, the difference being that diseases are real and vampires are not. Now, vampires from early folklore were very different from the vampires that we know today. In many ways, they were a little bit more like zombies than vampires. They were walking corpses that devoured the living in some way, yes, drinking their blood rather than eating their brains, but from what I understand, the idea of the sophisticated aristocrat that lives in a castle and transforms into a bat, and all of the other, associated ideas that we have about vampires, comes more from 18th and 19th century Gothic fiction, and particularly from Dracula, than it does from old folklore. Vampires existed in 18th century Gothic literature throughout Europe, but the first vampire story in English was probably The Vampire by John Polidori, which was published in 1819. There were many that followed throughout the 19th century, but of course the one that almost everyone has heard of is Dracula. Dracula was published in 1897, so almost the very end of the 19th century, and it had a massive influence on the vampire stories that came after it. One of the things that I found the most interesting about Dracula and other older vampire stories is the idea that the vampire can't cross the threshold into a household or a building without being invited in by someone on the inside. That's an element of vampires that I was kind of aware of before reading Dracula, and of course it exists well beyond Dracula itself, but it's something that I think is a little bit underused in modern vampire stories, and I would like to see more done with that concept. Now, I couldn't possibly name all of the vampire books, movies, TV shows, and so on and so forth that have come out in the 20th and 21st centuries, but there are definitely a lot of them. In the present day, the vampire tends to be a more sympathetic character in a lot of cases. They may not always be the good guy, but they usually have some level of moral ambiguity. They usually have some ability to choose between right and wrong and to do the right thing, at least on occasion. Sometimes, like in the example of Twilight, there are vampires who are basically exactly who they were when they were human, except now with superpowers and immortality. Whereas in other cases, you do see vampires that are corrupted in some way by their transformation. Doing the research for the vampires video has almost kind of made me think that the Twilight vampires, at least as I remember them, don't really seem like vampires. And I think that may be one of the problems with the series. They're called vampires, and yes, they drink blood and they change into a vampire by being bitten, but at the same time, they're not vulnerable to sunlight. Of course, we all know what the Twilight vampires do in the sunlight. They're not vulnerable to other typical vampire weaknesses, like for instance, they're not required to return to their coffin every night, and they're not repelled by a crucifix or holy water or things of that nature. They don't have any aversion to garlic. I'm not saying that vampires have to check all those boxes, but I'm just saying the Twilight vampires don't check any of the boxes. I wonder if one of the reasons that vampires tend to be portrayed more sympathetically now and to be more humanized is maybe because we don't believe in them anymore. Of course, I'm not saying that in the 19th century people believed in vampires, but the vampire stories that were being written in the 18th and 19th centuries were drawing their inspiration directly from the folklore that really did believe in them. Whereas modern vampire stories usually are based more upon books like Dracula, so there's a further degree of separation from actual belief in vampires. I wonder if that might be one of the reasons that now we're inclined to want to see their point of view, to want to understand what it's like to be a vampire, to want to think that, some vampires could still be good people, and so on and so forth. Because it's not a concept that we really have as a thing that anybody would ever really believe in, so we can do more interesting things with it. We can think about, different ways of playing with it or looking at it. Whereas if you really did believe that your loved ones might rise from the grave as blood-sucking monsters, I think that would kind of ruin the idea of it for most people. I also think it fits with a larger trend of wanting to see many sides to a story. It's actually kind of a cliche in some ways for the monster to not be so monstrous. I made a video series recently talking about Once Upon a Time, a TV show that ran from 2012 until I think 2017 or 18, and they were about fairy tales, not vampires, but one thing that they often did was take a completely twisted and evil fairy tale character like Rumpelstiltskin or the Evil Queen or Captain Hook and put a spin on the story so that character was humanized and relatively sympathetic and sometimes even acted as one of the good guys. And that's just one example. There are plenty of books, movies, and TV shows out there where either the villain's point of view is shown and their motive and their backstory, or where the monstrous creature turns out to really just kind of be misunderstood or things like that. I think that's an idea that just in general we find to be really intriguing and appealing right now. And so it's not surprising that it impacts vampires as well as other kinds of stories. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you'd like to see more like this, but without the vampire fangs, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, literary concepts, classic literature, college tips, study tips, and much more.